I'm happy to introduce to you the next fireside. We're calling it Fireside Interview, which will be moderated by Leila Hisseni, who's, there you go. Hi, Leila.
Hi,
Um,
everyone.
Hi, from the Global Fund, Global Women's Fund. And Leila will be interviewing and having discussions with key feminist activists, practitioners, researchers in this next session. So Leila, without much further ado, I'm going to hand it over to you. You do have the same time. We had 10 extra minutes, so you're good to go.
Thank you. Thank you, Muthani. Thank you, Lara. It's really great to see you both and to be part of this conversation. I'm Leila Hisseni, Vice President of Programs at the Global Fund for Women, and I'm really excited about the shared advocacy agenda that I think will really move forward practice and theory and evidence and policies around gender-based violence. So this panel brings together a diverse group of individuals, and we know that we need intersectional change and strategies. So we're bringing together a journalist, an activist, a funder, and a researcher, all who are committed to eliminating gender-based violence in all its forms. And I say all its forms because I think that's a critical part of the advocacy agenda. So we'll hear a little bit more about what prevention means, how it should be funded, what difference a global advocacy agenda can make for the work that we do. And so I'm really thrilled to be here with a series of panelists. So we have Catalina. Oops, I'm so sorry. 1 minute, bear with me.
Hello.
Hi, Catalina.
Hello. Thank you
Hi.
so much for having me here.
Yeah, so we have Catalina who's here. Catalina Ruiz Navarro, who's a feminist journalist and founder of director of Criadores, and she lives in Colombia. We also have Luiza Drummond Veado, who's a UN program officer at Right. She's based in New York City, but is from Brazil. We also have Shruti Majumar, who's a GBD specialist who works at the UN Trust Fund to end violence against women in New York City, and Dr. Anjalee Kohli, who's assistant professor and senior research officer at the Institute for Reproductive Health at Georgetown University. So really thrilled to have you all with us. And I'd like to begin with you, Catalina. If each of you could just say in one word, what can a global advocacy agenda do to deepen and support your work on gender-based violence? And just in one word, I'll go around the room and then we'll start the fireside chat. So Catalina, I'll begin with you.
In one word, it would be long-term funding.
Thank you. Thank you, Catalina. Luiza.
If you're going to get one word, it's resources.
Thank you. Shruti?
Thanks, Leila. My one word is going to be hope.
Hope. I love that. Thank you for providing us with hope. And then Anjalee.
My one word is transform.
Transform. Great. Thank you so much. Those are all key words that I think are critical to the work we do, and we'll do a deeper dive into what each of those mean. So I'd like to begin with you, Catalina. Can you tell us more about what role does feminist journalism and the media in general play in preventing gender-based violence? Again, it's in all its forms. And how can it be a better supporter to everything that we're doing here with the accelerator?
All right. So as you probably have seen, we have seen in the last 10 years an augmentation of claims of sexual harassment and sexual abuse all around the world. Around the world, it's known as the Me Too movement, but we have initiatives that came before that, like 2016 in Latin America, and we have a precedent of something that we call the Scrache, which was a strategy born from the dictatorships of the south of America, where justice wasn't enough, so people will just go and denounce and write in a wall, this guy was a torturer during the dictatorship. So this outbursts of claims, public claims that you just do somewhere, we call them escrache in Latin America. And in feminism and women who live through sexual violence and all sorts of gender-based violence, what they have become they started doing in the last 10 years was scratches. They will go online and they will say, this guy was my harasser and he did this and that. And it became a whole movement that is right now chilling because we are feeling the backlash. And the backlash has a lot to do with the risk that women and other people that have to denounce sexual violence take when they do scratches. I'm all in favor of scratch because I think this is part of our freedom of speech. But when people do this, they are vulnerable to legal claims and liabilities that will be very expensive and will probably end their careers, and also a lot of harassment and emotional damage because their re-victimization is so harsh. And there's another way. People that have lived through this violence, they could go to and make a legal claim at a fiscalia, the prosecutor, and then a process will start that will take around 5 years, and it will take half of your time, and you will forever be connected to this. Oh my God, forever. And what we are trying to do is a way that it's intermediate. With feminist journalism, we can tell these stories, protect the sources without telling their names, and we give like an instance of verification using the tools of journalism. And this has a great role in preventing gender-based violence because it's the same principles we have for the peace process in Colombia: peace, reparation, and guarantees of no repetition. When you have truth, when you tell your stories, because women usually that are subject to this violence have to live in silence and shame. And that in itself is a reparation. And it is a guarantee of no repetition because once you tell the stories, whatever happens, other women will know. And other women will know this guy is a harasser. So he will have to stop it, or it will be very, very hard for him. And you will start a conversation in a society that will help other women recognize this sort of violence and denounce it. I just want to close saying that doing this is very risky because we journalists face a lot of judicial harassment. We ourselves are denounced for, we are sued for $1.5 million for a report we made on a very prominent filmmaker, and that all journalism should be feminist because journalism is always serving the defense of human rights, and it serves to give people in a democracy enough information and quality information so they can make informed decisions. And it's a way to observe power and keep power in balance. And patriarchy is one of the biggest powers that we have right now. If you do journalism and you don't feel that you're defending a cause, you're probably defending the status quo, and the status quo is nothing but the patriarchy. So I really believe that us journalists have to take a stand on human rights and on women's rights. It's something very hard to do inside the profession, but I think it's key, and that is the future of journalism also. Thank you. And should I say my question to Luiza?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Catalina. Appreciate your powerful response. Now, can you please share your question with Luiza? Thank you.
Yes. So, Luiza, what is the one thing in your work related to prevention of gender-based violence that you will prioritize with more resources?
Thank you, Catalina. Thank you, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. And I want to start with saying to everyone, Happy Pride, because I think it's really important that we talk about this. And I think that when we talk about resources and when we talk about inclusion of all in the spaces, it's really important that we take an intersectional approach. And it's really important that we think about why are we talking about gender-based violence? And it has been a really big push from the movement that we have this gender-based framework. Because when we're talking, and exactly what Catalina just said, we're talking about tackling the root causes of gender-based violence. When we're talking about that, we're not only talking, but we're also talking about tackling the patriarchy. We're also talking about tackling the heterosis normativity that imposes things on us all. But it does affect us all differently. And those of us who suffer multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination and forms of violence, they are more likely to be left behind in policies, on data collection, in all those different spaces, because it's harder to have a conversation on saying that gender-based violence is not monolithic. It doesn't happen in one only way. It doesn't happen to all people in the same way. It happens in different ways. And I'm so happy to be here talking about gender-based violence, not only against women, but against gender diverse people, because this is so important. And if we didn't have this framework, we wouldn't be able to include this part of the population when talking about this. And I also think that it's important that when we center people who are marginalized, when we center those people who are not at the center of the conversation and we bring them to the table, that's when we not only improve their lives, but we improve the lives of us all. Because when those who are marginalized are pushed to the center and are pushed up, all of us are pushed up. And it's important that when we think about it, that we are all a multiplicity of identities. We're all a multiplicity of our own realities, where we live, what we do, who we love, our nationality, our immigration status, and all of those things affect the way that we see the world and how we do things. And I think it's really important that none of us, and I think that this is a very important pride message that we have as well, none of us should have to hide any part of ourselves to be included when we're talking about prevention and protection against GBV. And I want to leave it here because I think that's the main message I want to give. But I also wanted to move on and ask a question to my panelist, Shruti. And I wanted to ask you to tell us a bit about a promising program or a strategy that the UN Trust Fund has observed in your grant making that you think has contributed greatly to the prevention of GBV.
Super. Thanks, Luiza. Since I have 3 minutes, I'm going to take the liberty to talk about 3 strategies that, in my opinion, have contributed greatly to the prevention of violence against women. But before that, let me take a bit of a step back to say a little bit about where I sit in the world and where these strategies are really sort of coming from. I work for the UN Trust Fund to End Violence Against Women at UN Women. The Trust Fund is a grant-making mechanism that has, over the last sort of 25 years, supported primarily civil society organizations, especially women's rights organizations, in pursuing the Ending Violence Against Women and Girls agenda. For the past couple of years, we've been engaged in a very sort of intentional process of drawing out practice-based knowledge from the Trust Fund's archives of monitoring and evaluation reports. We call this our Learning from Practice on Prevention series, through which we've now published a series of 10 knowledge briefs on prevention. And these are really 10 themes, I'd say, that emerged as most salient inductively for civil society organizations that are doing this daily work on prevention. And of the 10, the 3 that really stood out for me are the paper on how to engage faith and traditional actors, how to deal with resistance and backlash within prevention, and how to do adaptive programming when it comes to prevention. I'm just returning from Afghanistan, where I spent the past few months working on violence against women, and just sort of coming out of that context, you can imagine why these 3 are particularly salient in my mind. On resistance and backlash, and Catalina and Luiza have both sort of touched on this, we know that almost all civil society organizations, especially women's rights organizations doing prevention work, can very quickly identify some form of resistance in their day-to-day experience, whether that's ranging from institutional inertia, denial of support for feminist work, pushback on what is considered as progressive feminist agendas, attacks on civil society spaces, or even the reemergence of resistance because of shifting political agendas. In light of this, doing feminist work that's really visible and exposed becomes a threat to the very organization and the people that are doing this work. And in light of this, looking at how, as part of prevention programs, CSOs are taking an adaptive approach. What are the kinds of risk mitigation strategies they anticipate that they put in place to tackle resistance becomes quite critical. And this is something that we've documented quite rigorously in our series. One example that really stayed with me is that of an organization that we support in Turkey called ACEF, or the Mother Child Education Foundation, which implemented its prevention program in a context of sort of increasing conservatism and traditionalism. And during the program, while we were supporting it, they lost their sort of primary and critical partner within the state ministry. This kind of pullback really led to severe disruptions in the program and pushed them to really redesign to make their prevention program more resilient to flux, to political shifts. And they moved towards a much more sort of grassroots model that engaged deeply with local communities and partners and different types of civil society organizations. We also see organizations making some really hard choices on how to engage with communities, with especially faith and traditional actors, how they reframe or sometimes reclaim where gender norms come from, where they're situated within the community. And there's some really rich data in this series on learning from practice and how this is done across the globe by different types of civil society organizations. So I'll conclude by saying, the more we can bring this very real context within which organizations are doing prevention work into the conversation, the more we can document and put resources towards practice-based knowledge of what are the different types of strategies being used in light of shrinking spaces. And the more sort of adaptive, long-term and flexible funding that we can support for a diversity of organizations, women's rights organizations, faith-based organizations, youth-led organizations, organizations of people with disabilities who are doing this work, the more likely we are to sort of succeed as a field within prevention. Which segues quite nicely, I think, into the question that I have for you, Dr. Kohli. So, Anjalee, the evidence on GBV prevention work tells us that context clearly matters, right? But what are some of the sort of guiding principles around evidence-based in feminist-informed prevention that can be applied across any context?
Thank you. Thanks for the question, Shruti. And also, I'm so happy to be here with this panel and also at this event. In responding, I'm going to share some reflections from discussions that we've had within the Community for Understanding Scale Up, also known as CUSP. So often, GBV prevention programs are understood to be products that can be developed and transported to new settings. Yet this misses the important contextual, historical, cultural, social, and structural factors that relate to and influence how programs operate in their respective environments with communities while centering those most affected. Even the word feminist has different meanings across time and place, meaning that any evidence-based, feminist-informed GBV prevention program needs to understand and operate within its complex social context. Grounding our work and related partnerships in feminist values, such as being relational, building in self and collective care, understanding intersectionality, questioning hierarchies, and balancing power is an essential foundation to this work. Building in time to identify, understand, and return to these values is what makes them truly live within GBV programs and partnerships. In our work, we have identified several key elements, each grounded in feminist values, to GBV prevention programming and scale. Some of these include holding effective, participatory, in-depth, pre-program consultations with all those who are or will be affected to understand and follow their lead on what is needed and how it can be realized. Being accountable and responsive to communities, especially those most effective during and beyond the program. Operating from a place of learning, responsiveness, and flexibility with culturally sensitive approaches ensures that programs are not too rigid to meet the changing needs of a complex social environment. Maintaining a commitment to sustain safe processes defined by collaboration, mutual respect, and balanced power with an adequate budget is important. And realizing high quality, in-depth, and ongoing training and mentoring helps to build practice and support skill building. Finally, this work is political in nature, as it challenges gender and other disparities and power dynamics. Our work is more effective when it contributes to and supports existing movements and activism. Working with feminist values and these key elements is an entry into evidence-based, feminist-informed GBV prevention that accounts for context and complexity and works with those most effective. We are interested then in both the process and the outcome. How we get where we want to go influences the transformation we realize. I have a question for Layla, but I'm not sure if we lost her.
I'm back. Sorry.
You're back. Yeah, you're back just in time. Okay.
Yeah, apologies. Yes.
Well, my question for you, Layla, is how can the funding community better support this work?
Yeah. Thank you so much. And thank you all for your rich contributions. So I'm just going to go over 5 key points that I think are critical to more and better funding. And I'd like to just begin with the frame of thinking about funding and resources from an abundance framework versus a scarcity model. That actually promotes a lot of competition, and I think a lot of ideas that one project isn't as good as another and that we're competing for funds, versus really thinking that we do have enough resources if we use them strategically and wisely and fund the right thing. And there's a lot of work, as you know, that's being funded to support groups that actually are advancing militarism and violence and authoritarianism. So really thinking about funding from an abundance model. So my first point is to fund directly the work. And so to fund women, girls, gender non-binary, trans groups that are actually the most impacted by intersectional harms of violence, and to fund them directly to do the work at the local, regional, and global levels. My second point is to support them with multi-year core flexible funding that adequately funds the work. And when I say the work, I don't mean the project. I mean the work, which is about building leaders and institutions and movements. And yes, evidence-based projects and practice-based projects, but it really is holistically the work and what it means to fund movements in ways that look like we want them to win. So really thinking about funding comprehensively the work. The third point I'd like to make is to really fund gender-based violence prevention in all of its forms. And so we know that, and other speakers have highlighted this, that violence plays out in different communities for individuals with different identities and different lived experiences in very different ways. And funders tend to prioritize certain projects, certain strategies, certain interventions over others. And so really to ground, again, the work in strategies that look at gender-based violence across all of the different forms that we see manifesting itself. Fourth is that funders really need to reflect deeply on their own systems, policies, and practices to make sure that they're removing onerous barriers, removing reporting requirements, removing results-based frameworks that mean that groups can't get the funding, again, in the ways that really mean that they can do the work and support the work on the ground. And then fifth is to promote cross-movement dialogue and actions that exist across sectors, across movements, across the ecosystem, and not just fund in silos. Too often we see the funding world funding, again, certain prevention strategies, certain individuals, certain organizations, and also we need to often widen the tent and think about where's the labor movement, where are queer movements, where are feminist movement, domestic workers, other movements, adolescent girls, and how they're approaching the issues of gender-based violence, and really offer spaces for groups to come together and strategize and partner. And so thank you all so much for being part of this rich panel. I think there were a lot of great recommendations across different sectors, and I'd like to thank our panelists for participating and for our hosts for organizing today's session. I think I'm back to you, Muthani.
Yeah, sure.